And so I did that program. And after that, I moved to the Hudson Valley to farm. And that's where I started at the PFB. And I feel like maybe I short-ended that a little bit, because prior to, working in Ithaca, I spent some time living in Central America. I don't know if you and I have ever talked about that. I lived in Nicaragua for a number of years, and, agriculture, I lived in a rural community, and agriculture was just so central to the community and to the culture and to just day-to-day life in a way, like food and ag, in a way that isn't here, or I didn't experience here, or I didn't experience growing up in Western New York, where I'm from. And so I think, if I'm the full picture is, I feel like that really shifted my orientation towards food and ag, with that experience of living abroad. And then that shift of realizing that I need those skills. I want those skills in my life. And I took a very sharp turn in my career towards ag, which brought me ultimately to the Hudson Valley to farm.
So that was kind of your first, living in Nicaragua was your first experience farming, or did you have experience before then?
No, I didn't have any experience before then. And I supported some farm-based organizations there, but I wasn't even actively farming there. I was working for a local nonprofit. My first kind of real farming experience was probably, I was in Ecuador, and I spent some time there on the farm. And so that was like month-long, head down, full-time farming. So.
Wow. And then you made your way to the Hudson Valley, and you've worked at several different farms in the Hudson Valley, including being a founder of a farm, right?
Yes, founder of Rocksteady Farm out in Millerton. So I started at the PFP. I hopped across the river and I worked at Huguenot Street Farm for a couple of years. I helped co-manage that after Ron and Kate left, and then made my way back to Dutchess County, out to Millerton, where I worked for somebody else. And then we had the opportunity, the farm I was working at was Soulflower Farm, and that owner decided that he wanted to leave and sell what he could of the business. And so that was actually what opened up the opportunity for Rocksteady Farm to get its beginning to start, because we actually bought out someone's equipment. We were on the land that he was on, and we're able to start our co-op there. That was in 2016.
So you started that out as a cooperatively owned venture.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a worker-owned co-op, and it started that way. And I think, we were very early on in our understanding of what co-ops were and what it meant. I think a lot of people, they hear about it, they're excited about it, but it does take time to kind of learn and really understand. And a lot of the learning happens through trying to live into it. So yeah, we were eager to do the co-op.
What do so the co-op is our co-op is the Kingston Co-op is going to be a multi-stakeholder, which we'll have worker owners, and I'm but right now we don't have worker owners because we don't have enough staff yet, and we're developing the other pieces of our model. That's where our energy is. And I related a little bit to what you said about, we had this idea of what it was going to be like, and then kind of like reality is really different. Because, I think my idea, I haven't been part of a worker-owned cooperative before. So I think my idea, I've done a lot of learning, and, but I think being part of that experience is probably very different from like the book version, or even like learning from people's experiences, since it's also different. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the, kind of like what your expectations for being worker-owned cooperative were, and how those might have been the same or different than what actually turned out.
Yeah, totally. I'm trying to think, it feels like forever ago. It was only 2016, but there's a lot has happened since then, Katie. We knew it meant that there were three of us to begin with. We knew it meant that we shared an ownership of the farm. We knew that we wanted other folks to be able to join, like future workers to be able to join. We had some high level ideas of how that might happen. We had to lay out, as part of our formation process, like a basic set of requirements for people to become worker owners. I think you know, we had never, the three of us, worked together before. And so, I mean, what two of us had, and to some degree, but not all three of us as a team. So I think we knew it would be challenging in some ways, like we didn't have any illusions about that, but probably also didn't know how hard it was going to be, you know, to work collectively. I mean, it's just, you know, can be hard. And then it's hard when you're trying to do it when you're farming and startup farming, which is like this whole other thing to talk about the farming business. So, and in a lot of ways, I think we just didn't know what we didn't know, which is fine. And what we learned like pretty early on, even if we didn't put this language to it, is that there was a lot of confusion when people came to work for us around what ownership meant and what management meant. Because people came to the farm knowing that we were working on co-op and expected that very quickly they'd be able to have a say in like the day-to-day operations of the farm. And, you know, in reality, you know, every worker co-op is set up differently. And so in reality, you know, Rocksteady, you know, has a staff structure, and there's certain decisions that are made by staff based on the role that they have, whether you're the greenhouse manager or the general manager, or maybe you do a lot of tractor work. But just because you're an owner doesn't mean that you have a say in every single one of those decisions. You know, those ownership decisions tend to be higher level, like guiding, strategy, big picture financial decisions. So it was this really sharp learning curve for us as a team to realize that we needed to get clearer and set clear expectations. We were hiring staff around what power and authority workers and worker owners would have versus, you know, what different roles, what power and authority different roles on the farm, you know, gave you. And so, yeah, and I think the farm is, you know, I still work closely with Rocksteady, and I think the farm is continuing to kind of figure that out and learn how to do that. And it's something that I think every single co-op struggles with, right? Is defining areas of authority, defining who makes what decisions. So, and setting clear expectations. Trying to think other things that, you know, didn't, like, were different from what we expected. And I think more of it had to do with running a business together than maybe the co-op itself. Because, you know, the farm business is very difficult to make profitable. You know, like a food co-op, right? Like really tiny margins, like a lot of stuff in the food industry is really hard to help be profitable. So I think there was a lot of challenges around the business side and decision making and strategy, but I think it had less to do with the co-op side of things. And then, yeah.
Oh no, go ahead.
The only other thing I was going to say was there was a lot of learning about power and power dynamics between the three of us. Because you can be equal on paper and you have equal ownership, and we can say that we all have one member, one vote on things, and how that plays out can feel very different based on power dynamics that we're all, you know, everybody speaks in, right? And so there's been a lot of work a lot of like learning and work and adjusting based on that, of like, how do we really create something that feels like that power is more equal across the decision makers, you know, whatever decision-making group that is, whether it's the owners or the managers or other staff. How do you deal with power issues?
Yeah, I think those structural, like having the structures in place for clarity and, you know, and yeah, clear expectations. I think that was something that I didn't totally expect about this work, kind of, as you mentioned, that, you know, there's so many pieces. There's just so many pieces. And when people are sharing in that work together, it's beautiful and feels really supportive, and also can be really tricky and challenging to make sure that everybody's like, you know, both, yeah, just that there's balance. The balance is Yeah, this has been a learning experience. I'm just, thinking of our co-op at the moment. And I'm just like, woo, all the things. Yeah, it's so much. It's so much. When you all started the co-op at Rocksteady, were you like, how did you get involved with the co-op model? Like, had you already been thinking like, I'd like to start my own farm, or we'd like to start our own farm and we want to own it cooperatively, or did that kind of come up in a different way for you all?
Yeah, I mean, we had all been moving towards, this idea at some point in the future, having our own operation. And we were kind of at different places with that. So when this opportunity emerged, when the farmer that was previously on the land decided to leave, there was this opportunity on the table, and we all had to kind of quickly assess, like, is now the moment. And I think in that process, we had a community of support around us and folks that wanted to see us take on that land and start a farm. And it was in that setting that the cooperative model was introduced to me. Like I hadn't necessarily, like, I was looking for something different. I knew I wanted to farm with other people, that I didn't want to be a sole proprietor. But I hadn't quite figured out that the co-op was the model for me. Maggie and Dee, the other two founders of Rocksteady, who are still at the farm, they had helped start Rise and Root Farm with 4 other people. And so they had already had this kind of introduction to what it means, like the principles behind and the values behind, cooperative models and why that model works for them. So it ended up being actually very easy to align around that because of where we were all coming from, but it was not necessarily on my radar initially.
Mm-hmm. And so I know you've been working with Seed Commons as well, right? And I wonder if there's a piece of in terms of like community wealth funds and making sure that folks have the resources that they need, and I think Co-op Hudson Valley as well, make sure that folks have the resources that they need to get started in the co-op world. Was that something that did that already exist when you were starting Rocksteady, or was that something that came later?
That's a really good question. It's actually all tied together. So a local fund didn't exist, but there was a desire to have a local fund here. So maybe I should just back up and say, like, Seed Commons is a national network. It's a cooperative, actually, of small loan funds around the country that work with cooperative businesses in their local communities. And so Seed Commons kind of, they find the investors and they create this aggregated pool of capital, of money, that we as small loan funds around the country can lend out so that we don't have to do that. Right? We're stronger together by having this one pool. So there was no local loan fund in the Hudson Valley at that point, but there was a desire to have one. And so the folks from the Working World, which is the New York City-based loan fund, helped us get a loan, through Seed Commons. It was through the Working World, but as part of the Seed Commons network. And that was in part to kind of seed this movement to get a local fund off the ground, right? To back the farm with some loans, and then maybe get a local project officer and build from there. So it was interesting because it actually took, although Rocksteady received its initial financing in 2016, spring of 2016, it's taken until very recently to actually establish a fund in the Hudson Valley. And we're still like really early in our stages of development. So over the last few years, I was working with Deanna Warwin, and we tried to pilot a program, and that effort kind of wrapped towards the end of last year. And in the spring of this year, Co-op Hudson Valley emerged and been able to kind of build on a lot of the work that happened over the last several years, trying to bring a loan fund into existence. So, and now kind of full circle, there is a loan fund here, Rocksteady is here. And so now Co-op Hudson Valley is the loan fund that serves Rocksteady. So as the project officer of Co-op Hudson Valley, I get to still work with the farm, which is lovely.
That's so cool. That's so
Yeah.
cool. I'm going to take a quick break and say if anybody is watching on Facebook Live and has questions, just put them in the chat and I will ask them to Angela. So another, I think one of the more recent times that you and I spoke, it wasn't that recent actually, it was a couple years ago, was at an event that you and Micah were putting on about cooperative development in the Hudson Valley and kind of like creating an opportunity for existing businesses who aren't using the co-op model to explore transitioning to worker-owned cooperative, and for new companies who haven't been started yet to consider that as a model. So I wonder if you can just talk a little about what that process has been like, and I get one of the things that maybe you can like touch on a little bit, which is a question that we get a lot, is around the confusion about ownership models. And, a lot of people assume that we're a nonprofit organization, that the Kingston Food Co-op is a nonprofit organization, which we aren't. We're a cooperatively owned for-profit cooperative corporation. And so, yeah, just could you talk a little bit about kind of like business models, like what you see in the, what pulls you into the co-op model in particular?
Yeah. It's funny because at the top of my notes page for today, I wondered if we would get to this question of like, what are co-ops if they're not a food co-op? But then also there's this question of like, of the more legal question behind that, which is kind of like, what type of entity is behind there even, which is the question that goes to. So there, I could kind of approach this from two directions. There's kind of the legal entity side, right? So like a food co-op or any co-op could be a nonprofit or a for-profit. That's just the legal entity. And then they can choose to put kind of cooperative governing structures on top of that legal entity. And it gets pretty nitty gritty pretty quick when you start talking about taxes, and how you choose to be taxed. So we won't go into that level, but so, behind the scenes though, you're a nonprofit or you're a for-profit. And the type of co-op or type of governing model that you put on top of that could really vary. So you have the food co-op model, and yours is like a multi-stakeholder where you have customers, and then once you have workers will also be owners. You have a straight up worker co-op, right, where the workers, the folks that are performing the day-to-day labor, are doing the work of making that business run, are the ones that actually own the business. You can also have what's called a producer co-op. And so that's where several businesses come together and either market their goods together. So when you think about farms, for example, producer co-ops are really common in that. And there's the large cranberry brand, Ocean Spray, right? Or Land O'Lakes, like those are co-ops. There's also smaller, much smaller, like regional producer co-ops as well. And there's also things like shared services co-ops, right? Where people, let's say businesses get together and say, we need to access bookkeeping together. We need to access, financial management together. We need to access social media support together, whatever it is. And you can form an entity where businesses join for a shared set of services. So there's a lot of different types of models out there, but of co-op models, but the core elements are just like a group of people come together that want to meet a shared need. They form this entity and they govern it together, right? Like those are kind of the basic core elements.
It's like magic. It feels magical.
Right? It's really simple when you talk about it like that. But it can kind of be any, like there's enough different types of co-op structures out there to meet all these different needs from all these different groups, whether it's your neighborhood or your workplace, or a larger system like healthcare, right? Like you can kind of approach any any group, any sector with a type of cooperative. I don't know if that got at your question or if it was a little bit too muddled.
Oh, that was perfect and amazing. So yeah, I mean, to me, it just, the co-op model feels like the way of the future. And I know it's also the way of the past. Like, I mean, this is it's rooted in a lot of, it's a way out of like oppressive systems, I think, for a lot of people in the past, particularly people of color in this country. And just want to acknowledge that this is like this is not a new model. We are borrowing from people who have been doing this for a long time. People have been like left out of primary systems. So yeah, and so I wonder about, I'm thinking about existing businesses in the Hudson Valley. That workshop that you and Micah led kind of was a starting point for thinking about how existing businesses might consider transitioning to a cooperatively owned model. Have you been seeing that transition happen? Like, what are the trends there in this area? And like, if it's not happening, what do you see as roadblocks for people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's a lot of conversation about transitioning companies to the cooperative model. I see a lot of interest in the nonprofit sector, where there's a lot of nonprofits that want to shift to a model that's more democratic. And you know, a lot of folks are considering on that end more like a worker self-directed nonprofit like GWI is. But I haven't seen too many conversions in the Hudson. That's what we talk about, conversions in the Hudson Valley. You know, one successful conversion, which a lot of folks might be familiar with, it's been around for a bit, is Earth Designs Co-op, right? It was a sole proprietor and it converted to a worker-owned co-op. I don't know if I'm trying to think of any other conversions. I think that there's more startups happening than conversions. And I think in part because there's a lack of information and lack of access to understanding of how you would do it. That question of like, yeah, that sounds great. But literally, like, what are the steps that you need to take? Or what does it even mean? You know, like, what does having a co-op mean? Because I think there's a lot of just not misinformation, but just people don't have a lot of familiarity with cooperative models. And so people are like, yeah, I want a workplace that's more democratic. I'd totally be open to sharing ownership with folks, but I can't imagine having every single person being part of every single decision. Things like that. It's like, well, you can be a co-op and you don't necessarily need to have everybody be part of every single decision, right? Like, that's a myth. And so I think information is probably one of the bigger barriers. And then another one that comes up is just, how do you value the business that exists and all the time and the energy and investment that was put into starting a business, is maybe a sole proprietorship or a partnership, when you go to transfer ownership to all of the workers, let's say. And there needs to be a process in which you define what that is and agree upon what that is, because essentially in most conversions, what happens is that the workers buy the company from the current owner. And so you need to know how much you're buying the company for. And that's hard, you know, to do.
About valuing the amount of time, it's beyond a financial valuation, basically, right? It's like, maybe someone spent their life or their whole adulthood building this up. Mm-hmm.
Right. Even if on paper, it, you know, might not be worth that, you know, and I think that that's hard for some folks to understand and to get the support needed to like do that valuation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that this has been a huge barrier in the Hudson Valley, but I know in other regions it has been, which is just, okay, those workers want to buy a business. So where do they get the money? You know, like, they don't necessarily have the money themselves to buy a business. And a normal bank, like a, you know, traditional bank, isn't going to like line up, you know, behind these workers to buy a business they want to turn into cooperative. right? Like most traditional banks have no idea how to work with co-ops, have completely unrealistic demands and expectations and loan contracts around them. And so I think that that's one of those unique places where like Co-op Hudson Valley and the other funds that are in this larger network, the Seed Commons network, can step in, is that what used to be a barrier is no longer a barrier, right? There's now money available to help workers buy that business out and support them in that transition process.
Which is amazing. Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I think like you mentioned that we just don't have, it still feels like such a peripheral model, right? It's still foreign. Like people don't see it demonstrated very often, or it's like in very small businesses or in very, very big businesses. So yeah, it does feel, I can definitely understand how it might feel like a big thing to try to grasp if it's a new idea. I wanted to ask you a question about one of the principles of Seed Commons, the Community Wealth Cooperative, which is national, that you had mentioned earlier, which is about radical inclusion. I don't know if you're, I know this is not like your necessarily like I don't know how much you were involved with coming up with these values or not, but this value is really interesting. And I wonder if you would talk about it a little bit in terms of your work, and kind of talks about extractive economies and deindustrialization and systemic discrimination, and how that plays into the where the co-op world can do some like mending and healing.
Yeah, so just to zoom out just a little bit, so Seed Commons has a set of values behind the capital that they pull together. So Co-op Hudson Valley, if we want to access capital through Seed Commons, we also need to uphold those values and embody those values in the work that we do, and happily do that, right? And also part of that is understanding what those values look like in our own communities and shaping it based on what it looks like here and what our communities are experiencing. Because what's going on in the Hudson Valley might look different than rural Tennessee or LA or Northern California. Like there's different communities have experienced exclusion and discrimination, deindustrialization in different ways. Different people within our communities have been excluded, from economic stability. And so we kind of take those broader values that Seed Commons offers up, and we try to ground it here, in our local community. And so this radical inclusivity value, speaking to the fact that we are very explicitly looking to support projects that are led by or are in service to communities who have been historically marginalized. And some of that, and so very specifically, right, we're talking about Black, Indigenous, POC, women, immigrants, queer folks, and poor white folks, right? That have not been either through like legal means, right? Like there's very clear discriminatory practices within lending institutions. You think about redlining, the inability for Black families to own homes and build generational wealth, right? Like we know these legacies are here. And so, the goal with our fund is to very specifically, support these folks that have been historically marginalized and help them build wealth and take control of, I want to say like that economic development. That sounds a little bit like, I don't know, institutional almost, but like having the ability to self-determination, right? To say, this is what we need in our communities. We know how to provide it, and what we need is a little capital, a little bit of money to help make that a reality. But together we're going to manage it and bring it into fruition, right? And so wanting to, you know, lift up, center, prioritize these communities in the work that we do. And it's a very like real and specific part of like how we assess projects, just to put it out there. Like each of the values that are listed on the Seed Commons website, it's actually like part of the loan application. This is not like something that just is nice and on paper, you know, like if there's a project, you know, in the Hudson Valley that would like to apply for a non-extractive loan, and, you know, as a project officer and take it to the credit committee, they're going to challenge me. They're going to be like, okay, well, talk to us. Like, what does your community look like? What does your community need? How does this project meet this set of values? And I had to be ready to speak to that, you know, for the Hudson Valley, for our context. So.
That's awesome. I really love to see such a direct link between organizations' values and decision-making processes, because sometimes it doesn't always work that way. So that's refreshing and beautiful to see that there's real power placed behind these values. And of course, you know, with wealth and money, those things are, yeah, those systems of oppression get multiplied out if we're not being really on top of it all the time. So
yeah. And I think if I could add one more like piece to that, which is, you know, I think it's our approach to this is not one of like community service and charity. Like it's about solidarity and self-empowerment, you know, and self-determination, right? Like we are not like Coop Hudson Valley doesn't exist. Seed Commons doesn't exist to like help anyone. Like Seed Commons has literally emerged, you know, from the cooperative movement, from grassroots organizations, saying like we need access to capital in order to develop the community, you know, in the way that we envision, in order to build power in our communities, to take control of our workplaces, to take control of how money's invested in our communities, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so that feels important to say to you that this is there's no charity at all in this model. It's a really special, like unique network of grassroots folks that are coming together, and we're learning how to do the work of moving capital, right? A lot of us, like I'm a farmer, and you know, other folks are coming from all sorts of backgrounds, but we know it's an important tool, and I feel like we're in it, you know, with all these cooperatives that are doing the work in their communities, you know? Yeah,
absolutely. And maybe we'll just take leave on a final note of like your vision for the future. I wonder if you would just share, you know, what are your hopes and dreams for the cooperative movement in the Hudson Valley? What does it look like when we've attained the vision, the co-op vision?
The co-op vision.
To you.
I don't think the co-op vision stands alone, right? Like I think the co-op vision is part of a much larger vision of an entire ecosystem of things, right? Like, you know, an entire shift in how our economy works and how we relate to the ecosystem and how we relate to each other. I think that co-ops are one tool, and they're a great way to practice a lot of the values that are important to kind of building, you know, this next economy, right? It's not the new economy, because in a lot of ways we're, like you said, with co-ops, we're building on it and pulling and learning so much, you know, from our ancestors and from communities that have come before us, right? So we're just continuing to build on that and trying to build the next economy where people have control over their day-to-day lives. They can make decisions for themselves. They can access the resources that they need for their family, for their community. You know, there's a balance between meeting our needs and meeting the needs of the earth, right? Like it's all together in this cycle. And I think that non-extraction is a key piece of that. And so we're specifically looking at that, like in the context of finance, but I think that kind of underpins like my vision for like the future in general, right? And I think with co-ops specifically, I'm like, okay, co-ops in the Hudson Valley, like what does that ecosystem look like? Like what potential is there? And I could see co-ops like in any sector, in every sector, right? And co-ops coming together to work together, to support each other, to leverage resources, to build on what they're learning together, to spawn off new co-ops, right? And that there's a lot of this learning together about how to do it, and that seeps out into the larger community, right? The shared decision making, shared power, centering the needs, the folks that are doing the work, the folks that are the most impacted, having control, having a say. Those are all things that I feel like can seep out, from the co-op world into the larger community, as we kind of move forward and try to build something that is ever so different than what we have right now. I don't know, it feels a little vague.
I think that's okay. I mean, it's so big. It's
so big.
Every piece of the system of every part of every system needs could benefit from some co-op love. That's how I feel about it.
I agree. And I think we have so much. I think that in some ways, like by talking, we have to have a vision, something to work towards. But I also think we have so much that we already know that we can build on. I think about Kingston and I think about the Hudson Valley in regards to what's happened over the last 18 months with the pandemic, right? Like we have, and we know mutual aid, right? Like, we know what it means to come together and support your neighbor. We know what it means. Like, we had parents everywhere, anybody with children, like in this last year has had to figure out in some way, shape or form, like in their network, how to get certain needs met that maybe they did not have to do before, right? Like, and that is the stuff, that is like the fabric, that like upholds the, this layer of when we want to say, okay, cooperatives are entities. Okay, well, look below the entities. It's these relationships, it's these practices, it's all this stuff that we already know, right? And so it's just kind of like starting to weave that together into our like day-to-day work, into our business life, into imagining an economy that actually works for us. So it's not as far out, I think, sometimes as we think. We have so much already that we know, like in our, in our muscles, right? Our muscle memory is there. We know how to do it. So.
That's very helpful. Thanks for bringing us to that hopeful point. I think this whole thing was very helpful and educational. So thank you so much for taking time, Angela. This was really fun. I always love talking to you.
Yeah, see, thank you so much.
I learn something new every time. And thank you all for joining us. This has been a Kingston Food Co-op deep dive with Angela DeFelice, Project Officer for Co-op Hudson Valley. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to talking with you again.
Yeah, thanks, Katie.
Take care.
Bye.